Want to earn some quick cash? Plato's Closet in West Ashley and North Charleston is stocking up on cute and cozy fall styles. We pay you on the spot for your gently used name brand clothes and accessories. Plus, while you're here, you can stock up on must-have looks for autumn. We're the go-to sustainable shopping spot for teens and young adults. So stop by Plato's Closet in West Ashley and North Charleston today and refresh your wardrobe. Plato's Closet, located in West Ashley on Sam Rittenberg Boulevard and North Charleston on Rivers Avenue.
People are driven by the search for better. But when it comes to hiring, the best way to search for a candidate isn't to search at all. Don't search, match with Indeed. The hiring process can be slow and overwhelming. Simplify hiring with Indeed. Indeed is your matching and hiring platform. With over 350 million global monthly visitors according to Indeed data, and a matching engine that helps you find quality candidates fast. Ditch the busy work. Use Indeed for scheduling, screening, and messaging so you can connect with candidates faster. Join more than 3.5 million businesses worldwide that use Indeed to hire great talent fast. Listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/PODKATZ12. That's Indeed.com/PODKATZ12. Terms and conditions apply.
You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
You're listening to the Great Plains Archaeology Podcast. Join me as we uncover the rich histories of North America's Great Plains, exploring the latest archaeological discoveries and past cultures that shape this storied region. Welcome to the podcast. Welcome to episode 2 of the Great Plains Archaeology Podcast. I am your host, Professor Carlton Shield Chief Gover, and I am thrilled to have you join me on this exciting journey through the rich and fascinating histories of North America's Great Plains. So here on episode 2, we're going to be talking about basically just the animals, the four-leggeds and the birds and all that other good stuff that you find in the Great Plains, particularly during the Holocene. But just, another reminder, there is a video portion of this podcast available on YouTube. And for those that are watching on YouTube, I'm trying to figure out angles to where I want to shoot in the office. So, I shot, quote unquote. I recorded episodes 1 and 2 same day. That's why if you're watching, wearing the same shirt. But during the episodes, I went to the friggin' bookstore across campus and got the adapter I needed to run both my microphone and my external camera so I could actually use my laptop more efficiently for this episode. So if you're watching online and have recommendations for how I can better visually present myself and my surroundings, because for those that are just listening, I'm just got my giant wall of books behind me in my office, and this is being recorded here at the University of Kansas. So yeah, happy to get your thoughts and suggestions. Contact information is at the end of the episode, as end of each show. So hit me up on Instagram or send me an email. I want to hear from you guys as to how I can make this show better, both in terms of content, audio, and visual as well. And I will do my best, because I know Chris and Rachel probably got a little aggravated in the last episode. They're the ones that edit this podcast that I kept moving away from my microphone. So now that I'm doing this new podcast, right, for those that might remember Ruins, that was more of a static environment where I was interacting with the guest, but now it's just me dropping quote unquote knowledge. So I'm a little bit more animated with this show. But without further ado, so let's get into the kind of fauna that are on the Great Plains that are setting the tone here for how people are sustaining themselves on the plains, right? So like I mentioned in the last episode, these first 2 or 3 are really going to be focused on big picture of the Great Plains region. What's the environment like? What's the vegetation like? What kind of animals are available? And then how are archaeological sites in the history of the Great Plains, how are they classified? How are they divided? So as we move forward in the show, when we start talking about topics to individual sites in relation to the rest of the region or the rest of the time period, these episodes up front, they provide the necessary background that give you a frame of reference that you can go back to get that. Because within a 30-minute episode, there's only so much we can really get into the nitty-gritty. So last time on episode 1, we talked about the Great Plains region as a whole, how it's divided, the 5 subregions, what kind of vegetation we can expect, where the raw stone material sources, where are those found? We need to get into what kind of animals are available on the Great Plains. And there's probably one that you're already thinking of. But before we get to that one, and I want you to hold on to that in the back of your brain, right? Like what possible animal in the Great Plains could be so important to human behavior? And that deserves its own, probably the other half of this episode will be dedicated to that. Sorry, I just took a big sip of Pepsi Zero. It's Thursday. It's a work day. It's not necessarily a work day. It's still summer vacation here. But yeah, here we go, everybody. So what lives on the Great Plains, right? So the Great Plains, as a refresher, stretches from southern Canada, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, down to like southwestern Texas. And we do have a diversity of flora and fauna, right? So one, we do have, in terms of sustenance, what are people subsisting on? There's a wide variety of ground nuts, but also prairie turnips. Like there are grasses and tubers and tree nuts that people are throughout time intensively procuring, right? So it's not just meat on the plains, but there's a decent amount of ground nuts and especially prairie turnips. But in terms of what other animals do we got? There's a wide variety, right? So there's a fantastic book, and it's called The American Serengeti, The Last Big Animals of the Great Plains. And it talks about what happened to the 6 major species of the Great Plains in the 19th century, but also contextualizes it through the Ice Age. And one of the coolest parts about that book is how it compares Great Plains fauna to the African Serengeti, right? So that's the name of the book, American Serengeti, that the United States and Canadian Great Plains region had as much biodiversity of fauna as the African Serengeti, right? So it had the same kinds of animals the African Serengeti does today. So like this really was an incredibly rich environment. And the name of that book is American Serengeti, The Last Big Animals of the Great Plains. And it's written by Dan Flores. Came out in 2017. I will put a link to that in the show notes. And as always, like our major sources, especially for this section, we're turning back to Dr. Douglas Bamforth's book, The Archaeology of the North American Great Plains. This is it, right? This is our major source. And of course, that will always remain in the show notes, are my major sources for this show. And Doug's book will continue to come up. I'm not making any money off of promoting his book. I really do think this is a phenomenal resource. So if Doug ever hears this show, thank you for putting up with my nonsense since 2018. But he's not giving me any per diem, and I got to get on to content. So what other animals we got? We got snapping turtles, 2 different kinds of rabbits. We both have cottontails, but also jackrabbits. We don't have, snowshoe hares. Those are going to be in an alpine environment, not necessarily the Great Plains. Prairie dogs are another huge resource, antelope and deer. So we think of some of these herbivores. I'm pretty sure snapping turtle. Well, I don't know what snapping turtles are. They eat fish, so they're not herbivores. When we think about like large herbivores, antelope are a pretty big resource, as well as deer. Now, my understanding of deer is mule deer are a Great Plains and Rocky Mountains species. White-tailed deer, which do exist in the Great Plains today, I do believe, and I have no sources for this, so if I am wrong, someone email me or tell me I'm an idiot on Instagram. White-tailed deer come from the East Coast and the Appalachians, and they get pushed out with Euro-American settlers moving westward, right? So mule deer, ancestral to the Great Plains. In terms of birds, right, you get the different kinds of eagles, but people aren't necessarily eating those. Eagles, hawks, bald eagles, golden eagles, falcons, these are pretty common. But another huge one are sandhill cranes. So sandhill cranes, aka T-bones in the sky, are a massive resource. And there is a huge sandhill crane migration through the central U.S. airway. They cover the sky. They are their migration is a phenomenal event that for those that love birding or those that love nature should try to plan a time sometime during their life to make a trip out to the Great Plains and see that migration. It's incredible. There's the Sandhill Crane Trust in Nebraska, which is operated by like the World Crane Trust, Heather Hansen, who is the daughter of Jim Henson, the guy who played Kermit the Frog and was a famous puppeteer. That's his daughter, and she runs it. It's an incredible spot. Other than the birds, in terms of predators, we get we get wolves. So we get gray wolves. Yes, we get the American gray wolf. We also get coyotes. Wolves, coyotes. Coyotes actually were originally named prairie wolves. And that term coyote actually comes from a Nawa word, coyote or something like that. Devin Pettigrew, I think we talked about it on our Life and Runs at one point. But they were, colloquially termed prairie wolves up until the Southwest, and the Spanish speakers introduced coyote or coyote. But we also get grizzly bears. Grizzly bears, I do know this. Grizzly bears are actually a Great Plains animal. Like those giant little claws they got. Giant little claws, that's an oxymoron. Those giant knives they have for claws are meant for burrowing into the Great Plains, like to dig up the ground and the grasses and to burrow. They are a Great Plains predator, and they get pushed into the mountains during Euro-American westward expansion, right? So like the deer getting pushed out of the Appalachians, at least the deer got pushed out, whitetails got pushed out, elk just got annihilated out there. Grizzly bears become more of a mountain kind of bear as, in the 18th and 19th centuries, they're getting either hunted to extinction in their areas or pushed into the mountains. And these animals, right, are resources to Indigenous people and even, colonizers. And that's why it needs to be noted, right? Like these will come up, like the different aspects of these animals in terms of, are they being used as a resource to sustain populations, or are parts of their bodies being utilized in economy, right? So like bear claws, we'll talk about those later, eagle feathers, even some hunting strategies, like when it comes to the utilization of like wolf parts for hunting purposes. So that's clearly not all of the animals. And this is very specific to the Holocene, right? The Holocene is this period after the end of the last ice age, 13,000 years ago, up until today. I know people have been arguing for something called the Anthropocene, but last I checked, like people use it, but I think geologists decided it wasn't an actual thing. Like the basis for it hasn't materialized. I'm not sure how geologists determine these epochs. I'm not sure. Not a geologist. So we'll have to ask your geology friend. But throughout these 5 regions of the Great Plains, I know there's different ecosystems, but these are the primary animals that reside within the Great Plains. When we think of Great Plains, wolves, bears, coyotes, especially deer, there's elk in the northern plains along the Missouri River. And then there's one animal in particular that the Great Plains is absolutely famous for. And so we're going to dive into the importance of the North American bison here on the back half of this episode. So stay tuned after these messages.
Hey y'all, Darius Rucker here. A lot of people ask me, what inspires your music? And one of the big things is a strong sense of place. That's why I love my home state of South Carolina and want to share the awesome things it has to offer. From the beautiful mountains down to the sunny coast, it's got it all. Not to mention 2 of my personal favorites, great golf and amazing food. Come see why I love this place. Visit discoversouthcarolina.com.
Fall's here, and so are incredible sales at Tanger Outlets. Find must-have handbags, footwear, and all the latest fall arrivals, all at unbeatable savings. Shop top brands like Nike Factory Store, Crocs, Gap Outlet, Coach, and even more brands you love. Save more every time you shop with deals up to 70% off. Tanger Outlets, always on trend, always on sale. Plan your trip at tanger.com.
People are driven by the search for better. But when it comes to hiring, the best way to search for a candidate isn't to search at all. Don't search, match with Indeed. The hiring process can be slow and overwhelming. Simplify hiring with Indeed. Indeed is your matching and hiring platform. With over 350 million global monthly visitors according to Indeed data, and a matching engine that helps you find quality candidates fast. Ditch the busy work. Use Indeed for scheduling, screening, and messaging so you can connect with candidates faster. Join more than 3.5 million businesses worldwide that use Indeed to hire great talent fast. Listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/PODKATZ12. That's Indeed.com/PODKATZ12. Terms and conditions apply.
Hey y'all, Darius Rucker here. A lot of people ask me, what inspires your music? And one of the big things is a strong sense of place. That's why I love my home state of South Carolina and want to share the awesome things it has to offer. From the beautiful mountains down to the sunny coast, it's got it all. Not to mention two of my personal favorites, great golf and amazing food. Come see why I love this place. Visit discoversouthcarolina.com.
And welcome back to episode 2 of the Great Plains Archaeology Podcast. It's still me, Professor Carlton Shield Chief Gover, and we're going to talk about bison in this second half. Why bison are important to the Great Plains, both now and in the past. So the first half of this was a lot of rambling and just like, here's all the animals that we have. Bison need a little bit more background to them. So the North American bison, they're commonly known as buffalo. They're not actually buffalo, like buffalo are their own very specific thing. North American bison, these are very much a Great Plains animal. Now there are woodland bison, there were woodland bison, but realistically they're like meadow bison in the woods. They would like run between meadows. But the Great Plains bison, that is like the literal bread and butter of North American Great Plains Indigenous societies, diets. Like the bison are king in terms of subsistence resources. There's another, we'll talk about a queen later, but definitely in terms of meat, it is bison. Now, bison are important for a couple things, right? So we discussed in the episode 1 about the seasonality of the Great Plains, that we have seasons in this region. We have a summer, winter, spring, fall, all that jazz. Now, in the wintertime, bison are in small herds. They can be concentrated though, but there's 2 different kinds of herds. You have bachelor herds, which are just all male bison, and then you have nursery herds, which are cows and their calves. So they separate. You have the bachelor herds, you have the cow-calf herds. Now, during the winter time, there is poor forage, especially in the Western Plains, right? The Western Plains, which is a little bit more arid, a little bit more drier. Bison, by and large, regardless if they're in the Southern Plains, Central Plains, or Northern Plains, they migrate to the east, closer to the Missouri River, right? Because in the eastern part of the Great Plains, that's where a tall grass prairie is. You see how we're connecting the dots now? So there's much more abundance of flora. So as the winter die-off starts occurring, there's more forage in the east than is the west. It's not great forage, but there's more of it. And during this time, we do get winter kill, where there are bison that basically starve to death. As we get towards the spring, that's when we start getting calving season. That's when the pregnant cows start birthing baby bison. So this coincides with spring grasses beginning to grow, which is important because as grass is growing, they are more nutrient rich. So as grasses are coming back and reestablishing themselves after the wintertime, when they are in their prime, that's when bison are having their calves. And calves not only have the mother's milk, but they also have access to much more nutrient rich grasses to graze on to help them grow, right? It's not random. As we get to the summer, right? So in the wintertime, we have our bachelor and cow herds. They're separate, they're in small herds. The calves are starting to get born in the spring. Towards the summer, we get the bachelor and these nursery herds. They begin to coalesce and they're moving to the west. So they're migrating west towards the short grass prairie steppe. These small herds being coalescing into massive herds for the summer rut. So this is when mating between bison is occurring, right? So in these larger herds, and this is when the rut is taking place. This is when mating's taking place. And the thing with bison rut is male bison go They go hard in the paint, as the famous poet Waka Flocka Flame would say. They're very aggressive in trying to determine mates. And there's this really cool like evolutionary aspect to bison, right? Like if you look at Ice Age bison, you look at bison through time, like even just looking at bison latifrons, those horns, and they're horns, not antlers, which means that their horns are made of the same material as their fingernails. They look like longhorn cattle horns, where they're basically just jutting straight out. And if you look at the way that bison, like male bison, duke it out over mates, right, there's a lot of head action in which they're bashing into each other. And, you know, evolutionarily speaking, you can see those giant jutting out horns goring other bison and killing bison. And over time, as you look at skeletons of and the heads of bison, you can see the horns not only getting smaller, but more curved up. And, you know, like evolution isn't a cognizant process. It is the process of how a organism changes over time, but it's not intentional. Like bison didn't just think, hey, I'm tired of watching my friends and family die every time it's like time to get at it. We should, you know, evolve to have curved and shorter horns. You know, now with modern bison, their horns are curved. They point straight up. It is much more difficult to kill other male bison during the rut. So there's this evolutionary aspect to bison mating, that their horns have changed over time to reduce the risk of serious injury during the rut, right? So I think that's just absolutely fascinating. And with that, as the rut is complete and as autumn starts to come on, bison begin to migrate back out east. Now, there is a little bit of like circularity to this migration. They don't just follow the same path. Like there is a circuit that bison take in their migratory paths. Dr. Casey Carlson from Augustana has done really good research on that, and I will find that site, that paper, and put it down below in terms of bison seasonality. So bison are generally going to the Missouri River, to the Rocky Mountains. Like that's kind of their path, right? So, which coincides with the seasons of the Great Plains. They get up to the summer for rut, they coalesce in these massive herds. And then as it starts getting colder, they move back out east where there's just more vegetation so they don't starve to death in the wintertime, right? So there is very much a correlation between bison behavior, foraging and grazing patterns with climate and grassland, you know, seasonality, right? As precipitation decreases, so does forage production, right? So there's less food for bison to eat. If you go north to south in the Great Plains, temperature goes up, and so does the proportion of warm season grasses. So as you get higher temperatures, you get more, you know, seasonality grasses. So like, just fantastic. And then more food, of course, means more animals and more immense herds. More cool season grasses means better autumn nutrition and less winter kill, right? So you can see how the environment of the Great Plains from this east to west axis and north to south axis, how the vegetation and habitat are affecting bison behavior. And bison behavior in particular has a huge role to play with human behavior and how humans hunt these animals. So there is very much an intricate web in how these things matter and how they all coalesce into understanding the archaeological record and better trying to understand human behavior. Because if you don't understand the environment, you don't have a good grasp on why bison are moving across the landscape. And if you don't have that understanding grasp, you might completely miss why humans are acting in certain ways that they do. And there's differences in seasonal nutrition between bison, right? So not only just where are they at time and what they're doing, like the breeding of bison and how bison mate is also like incredibly important. So in the summer, the bison cows are getting knocked up, which means like pregnant bison in the autumn and winter is supporting the growth of a calf that's going to be birthed in the spring. So a lot of their excess fat during that time is going to be spent on, their energy is going to be spent on the production of gestating a baby bison calf. And so as they're moving east in the autumn, they are just absolutely fattening up on as much late season grasses as possible to survive the winter months and then give a calf in the spring. And as such, males in the wintertime are fatter, right? Because males don't give birth to baby bison calves. So all that dense late, autumn forage is just spent on themselves. Now in the springtime, all of the bison, calves, adults, males, females, they're all fattening up on fresh, nutrient dense and rich grass. And during this time, as they're fattening up, right, their hides are also thinner. So in the winter, as they're as they're going through their fat reserves, their hides are thicker. Whereas the spring, after they've gotten through the winter, their hides are thinner. They're just fattening up. Now in the summertime, female bison are absolutely fatter than male bison because the male bison are in rut. So they're all their energy is being spent on mating. The female bison are just kind of sitting there and getting, picking who they're going to mate with. The male bison are spending all their spring energy that they've been saving up for the summer rut. In the fall, all of them are fattening up again, and the winter hides are thick. So body fat absolutely matters for bison to get through the winter, and therefore for people's nutrition. And so bison are incredibly important, like as we'll talk about later in the show, and we have time to discuss it. We have a couple minutes. We think of people are hunting bison. Traditionally, bison are really only hunted en masse twice a year before you get horses. You have a summer hunt and a winter hunt. So in the summer hunt, right, the hides are thinner, and in the winter hunt, bison hides are thicker. Bison in the winter are closer to the Missouri River. Bison in the summer are closer to the Rocky Mountain Front Range. Hunted bison in the wintertime, what are those hides used for? Like if you have these thick bison hides, these winterized bison hides, it is very difficult to get a bone sewing needle through that hide. So those hides in particular are being used for blankets. And the male herds, those small bachelor herds in the winter, they're going to be more rich in fat, right? They're going to be huskier. So there's even from an ecological standpoint, if you're an indigenous person or even a Euro-American settler, male bison in the wintertime are going to have more bang for your buck. When you do a summer hunt, right, the hides are thinner. So when you're processing a bison, they've just beefed up from the spring. Male bison aren't going to be as tasty because they're jacked up on adrenaline. They're trying to breed, but everyone's hides are thinner. And when you have thinner hides, it's much easier to make clothing. So those summer hides from bison, if you're making clothes, those are best for your teepee covers, your shade covers, and clothing. So you can see this relationship between bison behavior and human behavior and the kinds of material culture that exists because of bison behavior, which is then determined by the seasonality of the Great Plains. So now we can see how all these connect and why I'm having to talk about environment and animals and animal behavior, because all these things intertwine. Right. So bison behavior is very much reliant on the ecosystem, the seasonality of the Great Plains, the environmental patterns, and people's behavior, hunting behavior, subsistence practices reflect bison's role on the Great Plains and how they interact on the Great Plains. So, right. So the big thing is like body fat matters for bison to get through the winter and for people's nutrition. Bison and people, that's a whole thing. Bison are a huge theme to archaeology of the Great Plains. We will talk about bison ad nauseum because bison are just so critical through most of Great Plains history. Yeah, I mean, I guess we're going to talk about some bison and forage availability, especially in like the late 1800s. There's also different herds of bison. You have like the southern herd, central herd, northern herd. These herds, they go through various changes over time. And I was recently out doing field work in Nebraska with the Pawnee Nation and the state archaeologist in Nebraska, and we were talking about bison. And there was a bison hunt that the Pawnee took part in like Western Oklahoma, if not Texas, in like the late 1800s. And they talk about how like the Pawnee just killed every bison possible, which isn't necessarily reflective of like traditional hunting techniques, but like the Pawnee were starving at that point in time, and their ability to hunt was completely predicated on permission from the U.S. government. But we'll talk about like hunting practices through time across the Great Plains, and not always was the intent to wipe out whole herds, but it did absolutely happen. So yeah, that's been episode 2, guys. I mean, we're getting through there. We're marching along. Next episode, we're going to talk about some actual archaeology. So thank you everyone for joining me to episode 2 of the Great Plains Archaeology Podcast. I can't wait to explore the mysteries of the Great Plains with you. Our next episode, we will dive into archaeological taxonomy of the Great Plains. So until then, keep your curiosity alive and your mind open to the stories waiting to be discovered beneath the prairie. I'm your host, Professor Carlton Shield Chief Gover, and I will see you next time on the Great Plains Archaeology Podcast. Thank you for listening to the Great Plains Archaeology Podcast. You can follow me on Instagram at Pawnee_archaeologist, and you can also email me at greatplainsarchpodcast@gmail.com. And remember, anybody can love the mountains, but it takes a soul to love the prairie. American author Willa Cather.
This episode was produced by Chris Webster from his RV traveling the United States, Tristan Boyle in Scotland, DigTech LLC, Cultural Media, and the Archaeology Podcast Network, and was edited by Rachel Roden.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.